Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina wa Habibina Muhammad al-Mustafa, Khatam al-Nabiyyin, wa rahmatan lil alameen. So we begin always in remembrance of the one whose grace has decreed that we come together tonight, the one who has given us life and has given us the bonds of love and friendship that we celebrate as we feast in one another's company and feast on this food. And we remember with loving gratitude, and we ask God to send His prayers upon our beloved Messenger Muhammad, God's chosen and beloved, the one who was sent to verify and affirm what all the prophets before him had brought and taught, and the one who was sent as nothing but a mercy to everyone and to everything. We ask for God's blessings to be upon him and upon his family and upon all of his righteous and true companions. And we ask for God's blessings and salutations to be ever upon all of his beloved messengers and all of those friends of God, those luminous women and men who in every age and in every place have stood for justice, for peace, for the ennoblement of humankind. We are really privileged tonight to have one of those friends join us and to enrich our company. Currently serving as the Director of Islamic Studies at Duke University, Dr. Omid Safi is one of the leading Muslim public intellectuals in America. He specializes in Islamic spirituality, contemporary Islamic thought, and medieval Islamic history. He served on the faculties of Colgate University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and now, of course, at Duke. And he has won both a great reputation and many awards for his teaching. His edited and authored books include Progressive Muslims on Justice, Gender, and Pluralism, The Politics of Knowledge in Pre-Modern Islam, Voices of Change, part of a series called Voices of Islam, and finally the most recent, Memories of Muhammad, Why the Prophet Matters. In fact, even Sister Eve brought a copy tonight for Omid to sign. So God willing, he will soon unveil a new book, at least that I've caught wind of promise, a new book on the medieval mystic giant Jalaluddin Rumi, as well as works on contemporary Islamic debates within Iran and American Islam. In addition to his teaching and scholarly writing and blogging and tireless efforts to reach the wider public through his writing, Omid has been among the most frequently sought speakers on Islam in the popular media, appearing in the New York Times, Newsweek, the Washington Post, PBS, NPR, NBC, CNN, and other international media. He also leads an educational tour, an illuminated tour, that he humbly just told me, a tour that's truly illumined by the souls who gather to go on this tour. And I know we have some of those souls, veteran journeyers with Omid here tonight. I know Dr. Nermeen, at least for one. So he takes this tour every summer to Turkey. And so he is no stranger to Turkish hospitality. And so he should be right at home tonight. Nasiruddin Tusi, one of our great philosophers and thinkers, said that the greatest form of love, the highest form of friendship, is when two people love one another because they both are unified in their love of their supreme end, the divine. And I really feel, and I hope and pray, that the friendship that we have with Omid and the friendship that AIC has with Omid will be that kind of purest and rarest friendship, where we are brought together and held together and forever intertwined by our common love of the good, our common quest for justice, and our common aspiration for something even higher than justice. So, Omid, it's such a privilege and a pleasure to have you here. Welcome, Dr. Omid Safi.
والسلام على أشرف المخلوقات والسيد المرسلين. Thank you all very, very much for your incredible hospitality, for your generosity, for having taken the time to come and give us an opportunity to be together. I've got a rather trite fashion of starting every single talk that I give. Somebody gave me this thing, and yeah, it's on, inshallah. And it's to thank people for the gift of their time. And it doesn't come out of some notion of mismanners. It's not Southern politeness, although I am a Southern boy, many other things, but I'm also a Southern boy. By this point in my life, I've lived longer in the South than I have anywhere else. It's actually a realization that comes out of a very profound Islamic recognition. And it's this concept that for all of us, for every single one of us in this room, that the number of breaths that we get to take in our life is measured. That there is no power on earth or in heaven that can add or subtract one to the number of breaths that has been written for us. And if you're somebody like me that 20, 25 years ago used to be a slender little thing, and now I am doing my best to assume the incarnation of the brown teddy bear, furry balding man, I've changed my size, my physical size, in a number of ways. And you know, you outgrow your medium clothes, and you go out and you buy some large ones, and then the extra large ones, and for a while I was in the extra large ones. Now I'm back to the extra large ones. This shirt is large. I'm actually feeling good. I'm feeling good, alhamdulillah. My children can put their arms around me, which is a beautiful, beautiful state of things. We are people who love knowledge, and we pray for a knowledge that's redemptive and transformative. Our beloved prophet, he who put aside his own private bliss with Allah and chose to come back here for us, so that each and every single one of us can have the opportunity to ascend, to have our own face-to-face encounter with Allah. Tells us to pray for a knowledge that's beneficial and to be saved from a knowledge that benefits not. So we love knowledge. We are the ultimate nerd civilization. We love books and books on books and books on books on books, commentaries upon commentaries upon commentaries. And if you're a teacher and you got a student, you got to give them books. Right? The zakat of knowledge isn't just sharing it, sometimes actually just giving people books. So I can share books, I can go out and get some new clothes. Time is different. The minute that we take this breath, that particular breath is never replaced. And so when somebody like me is invited and I get to come, alhamdulillah, from out of town and get to share an hour of your life, that's an ethical and a spiritual commitment for me. And what I want to leave here with is, how are we going to take this time that we've committed to spending together and make sure that we challenge ourselves? This is not about feeling good, because the world right now is not doing good. This is about how do we push each other, tap into that in us, which is deepest, most divine, so that we can restore some sense of loveliness to this fractured world that we have to leave for our children. One of the great sages of our tradition has a beautiful spiritual advice. It's one of the most insightful pieces of hikmah that I've ever heard about practicing presence. But it's also a profoundly challenging ethic. And he just says, have your heart be where your feet are. Have your heart be where your feet are. And I think about the ways in which many of us cause ourselves pain and suffering. Many of us are masters at psychologically and spiritually and emotionally fracturing ourselves, tearing ourselves apart, and projecting a part of ourselves into some distant past, usually a place that some trauma happened to us. Why didn't mommy love me? Why wasn't daddy there for me the way that I wanted him to? Why didn't that person love me? And then particularly if you're a teacher and you're around people who are committed to learning, we also perpetually hurl ourselves into the future. What's going to happen after I finish my degree? Is there going to be a job out there for me? Will anybody love me? That again. I hope something good happens, or I fear something bad may happen. Projecting ourselves into the future. We throw ourselves into the past, we hurl ourselves into the future. We're everywhere but here. And because we're so clever, and the shaitan can just go on a long hiatus, because we're just doing all that work all by ourselves, we even invent technologies to make sure that when we're together, particularly in gatherings in which the name of Allah and the Prophet is lifted up, instead of being where our feet are, instead of having our hearts be where our feet are, we're tweeting the clever thing that the guy just said. We're Facebooking, we're chatting, we're even, I don't even know what we're doing, but we're not present. We're not present. And in the process, we've even ended up losing a sense of what Tawheed is about. We think Tawheed is about God. God is already one. God can't be made into one since God is already one. If you've read the Bible, you know even the devil knows that God is one, and they shudder. The thing that is not one, the thing that's not whole, the thing that's not unified, that's us. We are the ones that are internally fractured. We're like a cup with holes in it, and we keep trying to pour water in it, and we act surprised that the water leaks out. Every single one of us is in urgent need of healing. But it's not just individually that we're broken. As a human family, we're also broken. Our technology, our industry keeps growing. Come back to these satanic devices. Each one of them holds more knowledge than all the computers in the world in the 1960s did. We're producing more and more and more, and yet have your heart be where your feet are. Take a look at where our feet are. Take a look at this world. 1 out of every 5 members of humanity is living on $1 a day. We've never had more wealth, and we've never had a greater disparity between that small sliver of people that have everything and over 1 billion of us that have nothing. I'm not just talking about people in Africa, people in Latin America, people in Asia. I'm also talking about right here in the richest country in the history of humanity. The numbers are each attached to human beings. The numbers are attached to lives that are suffering. And if there's one thing that's going to run through everything that I'm going to say today, it's for us to grapple with the spirituality of suffering as a crisis and as an opportunity for growth. The suffering is not just internalized. In this country, richest country ever, we've got the top 1% of our society owning 42% of the wealth. It's morally repugnant, the way that wealth is hemorrhaging at the top, and the most vulnerable people in our society are going to bed hungry. Read the Torah, read the New Testament, read the Quran. A lot of differences, some commonalities. What are the commonalities? Keep track of the poor, keep track of the orphans, keep track of the widows, of the strangers, of grad students. You know, people who are at any point in time the most vulnerable people in your society. This prophetic consciousness. You want to be like the Habib? It's not about your beard. Half of us can't grow beard. And if they can, they have issues. You want to pull your pants up? MashaAllah. That's not it. You want to be prophetic in your consciousness? Here's where the challenge starts. As you are, as you stand with the most vulnerable people in your community, that's how you are with God. That is the measure of our faith. That goes back to Amos, it goes back to John the Baptist and Christ, and it comes up to right our beloved prophet. I told you this is not one of those go home and feel good kind of talks, because our prophet says, if you go to bed at night and your neighbor is hungry, your iman is not perfect. And I want us to think about what that neighbor means. In some cases, it actually is the person a block away from you. I was at Princeton last night, staying in Hyde Park today. I've been in these kinds of places long enough to know that you just have to walk a block and a half. And you go from the most extraordinary level of wealth to folks who are just looking for someplace warm to spend the night, particularly as it starts to get cold. As prophetic people, what do we have to say? Where do we stand? And if you take, because I'm a parent, and I look at things not just as a Southern boy, not just as a Muslim, not just as a brown teddy bear, when you're a parent, when you've got short people running all over the house, you look at society through the lens of that most vulnerable group. Everybody else has their lobby groups lobbying for them in Washington. Who is standing up for our children? What does it mean when in the richest country in the history of the world, 20% of all of our babies are living in poverty? 40% of our black babies, 40% of our brown babies, 40% of our Native American babies are living in poverty. What you got to say?
I think it's more than 40%.
In certain places, I'm sure. Yeah. I know in the part of the Deep South that I live, once I step right beyond that realm of privilege, there's many places, including poor white families as well. So I want to come back to this question of what do we bring to this conversation. Right? The hour is late, the night is dark, but alhamdulillah, like tonight, there's a full moon in the sky. And that full moon is the prophetic tradition. This is a tradition that tells us that despair is forbidden. It's not about feel good. It's not about happiness. Happiness is this commodified, commercialized, consumerist part of the American culture. The American culture, like every other culture, has got beautiful things going for it. And right now, it's also tied into this thingified culture? Can I sell you something? And once you bought it, can I sell you the next version? Right? We just saw the unveiling of iPhone 6, which is somehow supposed to be the new divine revelation. People lining up for this newest gizmo. If Jesus today returned, I don't think we would have a line for him. For one thing, most people wouldn't recognize him because he would come back as an immigrant, as a poor preacher. I had the benefit of growing up in lots of places, Iran, the South, lots of parts of the world as part of my studies, Egypt, Turkey, Morocco, India. All of those experiences have shaped who I am. I grew up with the sound of the recitation of the Quran, with beautiful, fantastic recitations of Persian poetry, with classical Indian music, with qawwali music, Turkish ilahis. But I'm not gonna lie, I'm in my 40s, which means I grew up with hip hop, right? This was also one of the formative, and like good hip hop. Public Enemy hip hop, back it meant something, hip hop, right? Not just putting down my sisters and bling bling, but like when you grow up and you hear the prophetic tradition echoing inside you, and you listen to Wu-Tang Clan shouting cream, cash rules everything around me, but don't have to rule me. That's where we stand. We stand in a society that tells you, you are because you buy. We come from a tradition that says, you are because you're able to deliver the love of God to God's people. The extent to which you stand with people is how you stand with God. This is one of the beautiful insights of the Islamic tradition. It's also one of the most challenging parts. There is a way to Allah. Alas, it goes through human beings. Human beings are the sweetest and the most challenging. Except this one. This one is all sweetness. MashaAllah.
But that is how God designed us.
That's right. That's right. And since my friend Timothy raised the name of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, Rumi has this beautiful saying. He says, and now that I know that we have some short people in the audience, I'll PG-13ize Rumi's language, which is not always PG-13. And he says, every single one of us is a jackass.
That's a donkey.
Donkey. With wings of angels tacked on. Not that those people over there are donkeys. No insult to donkeys. Donkeys do as Allah creates donkeys. A donkey never gets up and says, SubhanAllah, I'm a giraffe. Right? Donkey does donkey things. Clouds do cloudly things. Grass does grass things. It's the human being. We are the one creature that says, I am Allah. That's why in our tradition we know every word in Arabic, in Persian, in Turkish, in Urdu, in all of these rich languages has multiple shades of meanings, and there is a wisdom, there's a hikmah inside every one of them. The word insan, human being, if you look up its etymology, can mean something that comes from nisyan, from forgetfulness. We've forgotten what it means to be human. Right? If you watch The Lion King, good Muslim parable. Rafiki, my buddy, my friend, is a Sufi sheikh when he says, you don't even know who you are. That is the message of our spiritual tradition. We've forgotten what it means to be a true human being. But the word insan, our tradition also tells us, can come from uns. intimacy, love, affection. You want to figure out what it means to be human, look to love. Look to love. But because we live in this commodified society, they've even commodified the most divine of realities. They can sell you love. They can package love. Just on an airplane flying over today, flipping through the magazine. Do you need love? I was like, yes, I need love. I very much need love. Look at itsonlylunch.com. And I was like, that's not the kind of love that I was looking for. I wanted love not as a sentiment. I wanted love not just as an emotion, though it's also that. I want love to be God unleashed onto this world. I want a love that is the very being of Allah in manifestation, bringing us into creation, sustaining us, and taking us back home. I want a love that pours out of the being of God as a gushing river. And for me to know that if I can ever deal with the crud of my own nafs, my own ego, and merge with this river comes from there and it's going back there. And look, we don't need Deepak Chopra to be teaching us about love. We don't need people to be doing $5,000 weekend retreats to be teaching you about love. Most of you, I'm guessing, have heard of Imam al-Ghazali, right? Our great, wondrous theologian, oftentimes compared to St. Augustine or Aquinas in terms of his stature. But have we read his brother? And at the risk of being a little heretical, his brother, who is so much cooler. Little brothers are awesome. I'm an old brother. I'm not very exciting. My younger brothers and my sister are fabulous. Imam Ghazali's younger brother is a guy named Ahmad. And he writes the first book on radical love, on ishq. Extreme love. Overflowing, abundant love. And in the first paragraph he says, you know, love is something you can't really talk about, but my friends begged me, pleaded with me to write something for them. And I agreed on one condition. One condition, that you don't ask me to make any distinctions between the love of humanity and the love of Allah. Because love is one. If you can ever deal with your own ego and purely love somebody, you've had a taste of the love of Allah. What do we do with that love in the society? We take that love and we say, no, it has to look like this with that person. We've taken love and we've collapsed it into a physical, sexual love. Just don't get me wrong, it's all good. If you can get it kosher and halal, it is all good. But if you can't, and if you are one of those who hasn't, what does this tradition says? It tells us love. If you can't find romantic love, love your parents. Love your sibling, love a friend, love a neighbor, love a child. One of our teachers even says, love snow. Love nature. Because everything comes from Allah. Why love? What is it about love? Love is this fire that propels you beyond your own ego. Love says, I will serve you. Love is alchemy. Love is a fire, as Maulana Rumi again says, حاصل عمرم سه سخن بیش نیست خام بودم پخته شدم سوختم. The whole of my life is summed up in these three little phrases. I used to be raw, Then I was cooked. Now I'm on fire. You might want to have raw fish, sushi. You wouldn't want to have raw kebab. If the kebab stuff back there was raw, none of y'all would want to touch it.
It's not true.
You would want something to be cooked in the fire. Why is it that so many people hurt us? Because they're not done cooking. We are taking people into our hearts who are raw. And they cause us indigestion. And we cause other people indigestion. What does Maulana Rumi say? He tells us, I used to be raw. Then I was cooked. Why not stop at cooked? Because by the grace of God, there are those people still walking on earth that when you're around them, they're on fire, but you cook. They remind you that fire is real, that transformation did not end in the age of the prophets, that God is still working with humanity. And when you find one of these people, you sit your tush down and you get cooked. I barbecue, I grill, and if you slap a piece of meat on a grill, apologies to vegetarians, it doesn't work with like asparagus. The meat makes a little sound, jizzling sound, when you slap it on a hot grill, because it hurts. And that process of transformation hurts, because it is the ego coming undone. That little God that each of us create inside ourselves realizes, La ilaha illallah. We have to say no to these little gods that we carry inside before we can say yes. We said yes in the beginning, qalu bala, primordial covenant. But we forgot that through this love is what we can remember. This tradition is your heritage. The thing I beg and plead with Muslim audiences everywhere I go, claim your inheritance. Know the full spectrum of the jewels that have come to you over 1400 years. Wallahi, it is not just the people out there who are illiterate about us and our tradition. We ourselves are semi-literate at best. Even our scholars, and I'm looking at this little chubby brown guy over here, even our scholars have mastery over a small subset. Cast a bigger net. Learn from different people. Don't make idols of your teachers. Adab, yes. Ihtiram and respect, absolutely. Don't make idols of your teachers. This is one of the traditions that has been passed on to us, and I would wish and I would hope and I would beg and I will plead with us to know this tradition as well as we know usul al-fiqh and kalam. We should know Maulana Rumi and Attar forwards and backwards. These are the clearest voices that connect the love of Allah to the love of humanity. Attar has a beautiful story from an earlier mystic named Dhunnun al-Misri, who has a vision of Yawm al-Qiyamah, the day of resurrection, the day of judgment. All of humanity is present and they all come forth before Allah. They hear the voice of God coming to them saying, who here wishes to be spared hellfire? 90% of people put up their hands. and they hear the voice of Allah, it is granted unto you. All of you who put up your hands are spared hellfire. And they are happy and they leave. They hear the voice of Allah a second time. Who here wishes to be granted the highest level of paradise? 90% of those who are left put up their hands. A second time they hear the voice of Allah. It is granted unto you. They do the little happy dance, they all leave. There's but a handful of people left. If you know the Muslim tradition of storytelling, everything happens in threes. This time, the voice of Allah comes thundering at them. I offered you deliverance from hellfire, you took it not. I offered you my most luminous level of paradise, you did not stand. What are you waiting for? And it's this handful of people who say, Ya Allah, we did not come here to be spared hellfire. And we didn't come here for the garden. We came for you. And then they hear the voice of Allah a third and final time saying, in that case, I am yours. That too is part of our tradition. That too is one of the gems of our tradition. The love that they're speaking of is not Valentine's Day. It's not hearts, roses, and full moons and the chocolate industry commodifying love first on Valentine's Day, then on Mother's Day. I don't want to hear none of this like, for Muslims, every day is a Mother's Day. If that's true, serve your mama. Take care of your mama. Walk in your mama's footsteps, let your mama be your sheikh, see what your mama does, you do what your mama does. Right? Then you can open your mouth and say, every day is Mother's Day. If you love somebody, serve them. There is nothing great that can be accomplished without sacrifice. And that's the question that I want us to be asking ourselves. What are we willing to sacrifice? I am not naive, believe me, about the state of our community today. I get between 300 and 500 pieces of hate mail every week. And the one thing that I always ask audiences for is please pray for the protection of my children, of my family, because there's some sick people out there. The question that we want to be asking, given the hatred that's out there, given the pressures on us to conform, to assimilate, to play the good Muslim game, what are we willing to stand for? What are we willing to stand up for and realize, as our sages from the black tradition used to tell us, a man can't ride your back unless it's bent. When are we going to straighten up our back and say, yes, I will speak out against ISIS. Yes, I will speak out against Boko Haram. Yes, I will speak out against Hamas rockets. But you know what? With that same breath, out of that same compassion and love, I'm also going to stand up and say, why are there 500 Palestinian children under the ground? Who speaks for those children? Who speaks for the over 3,000 people killed by American drones?
Yes.
That's my tax dollars. That's your tax dollars. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel in my opinion, the most prophetic voice of Judaism in the 20th century, has this beautiful insight that he says, few are guilty, all are responsible. All are responsible. This is the insight that we got to be bringing to the conversation that Bill Maher and Ben Affleck and whoever else is having these days. We have to be more mature, more grown up than simply playing the endless game of I hate and condemn, I hate and condemn, I hate and condemn. We've been hating and condemning for 13 years. As long as we're only defending ourselves, defining ourselves in the negative, when do we get to stand for love? When do we ever get to stand up for justice? When do we get to speak about beauty? Because make no mistake, when we've been speaking about love, if you know your history, if we know our history, if we know the history of where we've come from, what is it that Brother Martin taught us? What is it that the students sitting in the lunch counters of my state, North Carolina, in Greensboro, used to say? When love comes into the public arena, we call it justice. That's all we mean by justice. Justice is not some economic model of distributing your finite resources. Justice is, I love my babies. And I recognize that other people love their precious babies. I insist on certain things for my babies. How do I connect my love for my babies to other people's love for their babies? That's what we mean by justice. Love in a public arena. What I wouldn't want to have people do to my children, I will not allow to happen to other people's babies. And other people's babies, not just in your immediate neighborhood, everywhere around the world that I travel, this is the one true universal. Everybody loves their children. Everybody wishes the best for their children, and everybody wants their children to marry somebody exactly like them. That last part we got to work on. We are not meant to be a tribal people. We worship a cosmic and infinite God. We don't begin by saying, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Iraniyin, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Pakistaniyin, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Arab. No. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, of all the worlds. Be careful about where you draw your boundary of your love. How wide is your circle of your love? Does it end with you? That's nafs. That's ego. That's my holy trinity. My three favorite people in this world are me, myself, and I. You make it a little bit bigger and you encompass your family. Good. You move beyond your ego. That's nepotism. You make it a little bit bigger and you say, okay, my ummah. Religious chauvinism. Make it a little bit bigger if you're a minority community in America right now and you say, people who carry my passport, blind nationalism. You gotta keep deepening and expanding your circle of concern until everybody that God loves is included inside it. No exceptions, period. We as Muslims are in a deep state of trouble right now. In spite of the many of us in this room who keep teaching, and I know how long and how hard some of us have been teaching, the level of prejudice against Muslims keeps going up and up and up. It's worse now than it was at the time of 9/11. 39% right after 9/11, 49% in 2010, only 27% of Americans now have a positive view of Muslims. Flip it around, 71% of Americans don't. The issue, the challenge, is not just about Islamophobia. I like the idea of teaching people about Islam. It'd be great if Jon Stewart and Oprah and whoever else could just have like a daily session on teaching people. But you know what? Sending every American a copy of the Quran is not going to solve this problem. Because America, and I will speak slowly so I'm not misunderstood here, since they're listening, because they're always listening. Brother Malcolm used to begin every talk by saying, Assalamu alaikum, friends and enemies. Because we're fooling ourselves if we think that there's not some of the enemies here with us today. And he said it with a smile, but I think he also meant it. I know that my email is checked. I know my phone is wiretapped illegally. I know that I have to stop making jokes about, he's the bomb. Because the agent listening in Arizona doesn't grab my sense of humor. So, since they're listening, I will articulate it clearly. America is and has been from the very beginning both a dream and a nightmare. It is now and it has always been that way. America started out as a noble dream for some, defined as land-owning white people. Men. A small section of the society. Within that small circle, a beautiful dream that all white land-owning men are created equal. Proud zenith of the Enlightenment tradition. The American dream starts with a genocide of our indigenous brothers and sisters. The American dream is based on 400 years of slavery. The American dream is based on the exclusion of women, of indentured servants, including whites. And let's take seriously the challenge of how many of us, and I'm looking at my own brown skin, lovely mocha brown. I love my skin, I love my body, I love how Allah made me. It took me 44 years to love my brown self. But I love brown people, love black people, love a lot of white people. We have to be truthful. We have to love one another enough to tell each other the truth. We have to know our own history and know that when we as brown immigrants arrived in this country, we did our darndest to qualify as white. We fought in the Supreme Court, case after case after case after case. Please, Master, count us as white. Don't let us be black. Anything but black. The Supreme, we have to know this. If we're wondering, why are we having a hard time bringing together immigrant Muslims and black Muslims, know your history. We didn't cause all the problem. The immigration system was racist from the get-go. There was an Asiatic quota, that we have to know that too. But assume ownership over the people that brought us here. The Supreme Court handled cases. Are the Japanese white? They said no. That was a court case. Are Sikhs white. The Sikhs had a great argument. They're like, you white people, you're Indo-European. You can't have Indo-European without the Indo. We're the Indo. We put the Indo in the Indo-European. The Supreme Court said no. Our Syrian friends, 1914 to 1923, went to the Supreme Court and argued, George Dow, argued, we are just like Jews. You have already decided that Jews are white people. Look at us. We're practically Jews. And they won. They won that argument. This is how most of us don't know this. This is how most of us brown immigrants got to have the privileges of being white while still hated for being brown. I want us to be a prophetic people, that when we encounter systems of injustice, we say, we are not going to identify with the well-adjusted, we're going to stand on the side of the people who at the moment find themselves weak and vulnerable. When New York City is running stop and frisk, and 90% of the people who stopped are black and brown bodies, our response should not be, well, thank God I live in the suburbs. If you're trying to understand why is it that we are not very mature in this coalition building, we have to be able to get this message. We can't expect anybody, and because of this sweetheart here, I'll modify my language, to give a darn about us unless we give a darn about other people. You have to be there on the front lines with African Americans, with Hispanics, with poor people, with labor unions, with environmental groups, with women's rights organizations, with gay and lesbian groups. What happens to them is going to happen to you. Either we go up together or we go down together. And if you put all of us together, we are the present and the future of America. And those white people who are willing to acknowledge that America is changing. They have a role too. They have a part too, as long as they don't insist on defining what it means to be American for the rest of us. This notion is part of the prophetic tradition. If you know your Bible, if you know Matthew chapter 25, you know this. That which you do to the least of God's children, you do unto me. Take a look around, figure out who's vulnerable. Love them enough to speak the truth, to do the truth-telling, even if it calls for a sacrifice, because it will. Be willing to pay the price. Part of what I want to do, and I'm a Muslim and a teacher and occasionally a preacher, so talking too much is a common predicament. But what the heck. I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about our history in the civil rights movement. I want to show you just a couple of quick pictures. This is what we have done to Brother Martin. We've made him into a monument. We've made him into an icon. What do you do to an icon? Something that you hold up and venerate. But an icon is not a prophet. The prophetic tradition doesn't ask you to hold it up and venerate it. The prophetic tradition comes to challenge you. Right? As I've said before, no prophet has ever come to his or her community and said, God is really pleased with how you're handling the poor people. Keep doing what you're doing, change nothing. Right? Said no prophet ever. Ever. What do we do with the prophetic tradition? We try to sanitize them, and this is what we're not willing to deal with. If you think that the American civil rights movement started with Rosa Parks, ask Rosa, what were you thinking when you refused to give up your seat? And she will tell you, I was thinking of Mammy Till weeping over her precious baby, Emmett, 14-year-old teenager who'd come down south to Mississippi, allegedly whistled at a white woman, and these two terrorists dragged him out of the bed and beat him so much that his head blew up to 5 times its natural size. And Mammy Till, the mama, said, I'm going to keep the casket open. Here in Chicago, you all know your history better than I do, Robert's Temple Church of God in Christ. This is the origin of the American Civil Rights Movement, for all practical purposes. It's when people allow their suffering to speak, but they make the hardest and boldest of decisions, which frankly, spiritually as Muslims, we still have work to do on this issue. They say, I want the whole world to see the suffering of my precious babies, but I will not give in to hatred. I will not give in to anger, but I will work each and every day of my life to redeem and transform the system that produces hatred. Brother Martin says the same thing. After you have the march in Washington, you got the 16th Street Baptist Church bombings in Alabama. And as he's giving the eulogy for those precious 4 girls, he says, we have to bring not only the people who committed this atrocity to justice, we've got to change the system that produces violence. This is where we've frozen the civil rights movement. We've frozen it on Martin, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., part of that Christian prophetic tradition of the black church, elegant, handsome, smiling, but we're missing a lot. Ella Baker, God rest her soul, said, Martin didn't make the movement made Martin. For every time that somebody asks us, why don't the Muslims produce their own Brother Martin? Why don't we produce our own Brother Malcolm today? Why don't we have our own Gandhi? The answer is, we have to invest in the movement. We have to become excellent and beautiful human beings collectively, so that someday, when the more beautiful of us stands in front of us, they're only saying things to us that we already know are true inside our own hearts. We have to invest in creating that collective movement. And to do that, every single one of us needs to find our voice. We got to be rooted, we got to be grounded, but you don't need to be somebody's echo. And we've got way too many echoes in our community. You can tell. Talk to somebody for 5 minutes. You're like, oh, you're a Sheikh Hamza person. You're a Sheikh Yasser person. You're Imam Suhaib person. You're Dr. Sayyid Hussein Nasr person. Beautiful teachers. Each one of them has forgotten more than I will ever know in my own life. Don't be an echo. Adab, yes. Respect, yes. Learning, yes. Figure out who God made you to be. What is the gift that you have been given, and live it. As Brother Martin used to say, if your gift is to be a street sweeper, sweep the streets as Mozart composed music. Do everything that you do out of that sense of love. As Muslims, and I'm going to start in perfect Quranic fashion, the critique with myself, we have confused success and greatness. We worship success, particularly immigrant Muslims. We all want to be successful. We want to be rich. We want to have a 3,000 square foot house and drive a Lexus. Are we great? Greatness as defined by our ability, our willingness to take our love and our resources and put it into the service of the more vulnerable people in our society. We forget that the march on Washington didn't take place without a gay communist brother, Bayard Rustin, and old labor union activists coming together. It wasn't Martin Luther King's march. It was the march for jobs and freedom. Jobs and freedom. And they tell you what they meant by jobs. It's right in their list of demands. Number 8, a national minimum wage act that will give all Americans a decent standard of living, $2 an hour. And you're like, well, we're like $7.50 right now. No, 1963, $2 an hour means about $15 in 2014 dollars. We got a handful of cities around the country that are doing that. We have not realized the demands of the march 50 years ago. The march for jobs and freedom. Freedom. I was blessed enough, lucky enough, fortunate enough to be loved and mentored by Dr. Vincent Harding. We just lost him on May 19th of this year. If you don't know that name, you will in just a second. Vincent Harding was the beautiful black man who wrote Dr. King's most controversial speech, the Riverside Church speech. And I sat at Vincent Harding's feet every opportunity that I got. I was in Turkey this year on the same tour that some of our friends have come on, and I got the news, and I was out of commission because I wept like a baby. It hurts when you lose your shuyukh. One of the things that I learned from Vincent that blew my mind, Uncle Vincent, as we called him, was I'm supposed to know something about the civil rights movement. I teach courses at a university about the civil rights movement, and gently one morning over breakfast, he said, my dear, he talked like this, my dear and beloved son, brother, and nephew. I was like, oh my God. Brother Martin and I, in fact, none of us ever called him the civil rights movement. And I was like, what? I teach a course called, the Civil Rights Movement. He's like, no, the only name we ever had for it was the Freedom Movement. That's why when Martin went to India, and that's why when we went to Africa, we saw their struggle and our struggle as one struggle. Not that we had to link our struggles together. There were people struggling to be free. We were struggling to be free. We saw ourselves as part of the same struggle. Martin, after the March on Washington, after the Nobel Peace Prize, is pushed, is loved, and is challenged to keep growing. To expand his circle of compassion. Think about, when do we do this to ourselves? When do we have people that have become icons in our community and we tell them, you're doing great, you're doing great, you got so much more to grow into. Who made Brother Martin grow? College kids. College kids that had formed an organization called SNCC, Students for Nonviolent Coordinated Committee, and they got Martin to see that the racism here in America is connected to the war in Vietnam. Reluctantly, slowly, Martin works on his own silence until on April 4th, 1967, he stands in the Riverside Church with that same Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel who introduces him. He walks up front and he begins by speaking, and he speaks his truth, and he says, I have come to this magnificent house of worship because my conscience no longer permits me to remain silent. A time comes when silence is betrayal, and for us with Vietnam, that time is now. He says, I've been silent, I've betrayed my own soul for too long. He says, men do not easily, he says, speak out against their own government, but speak we must. He says, I will never again. This has an echo and a ramification for us as Muslims today. I will never again speak out against the violence in the ghetto without speaking out against the, direct quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. When he speaks these words, it doesn't go over well. The FBI calls Martin the most dangerous man in America. Time magazine calls him someone who's engaging in demagogic slander. The Washington Post says that he has outlived his usefulness to his people and to his nation. The NAACP breaks rank with him. Jackie Robinson, that Jackie Robinson, critiques him in print. When Martin is shot on the balcony of Lorraine Motel, 72% of all Americans disagree with him. 55% of Black Americans disagree with Martin. People kept pleading with him, Brother Martin, you made it. You have access to the White House. We got the Voting Rights Act passed. Why don't you just stick to what you're good at? Why don't you just talk about racism? Why don't you just be a preacher? And he says, I have struggled for too long and too hard against segregated public accommodations to end up at this point in my life segregating my moral concerns. He says, I don't think these people know the world in which they live. I'm not even sure that they understand Jesus. Do they not, and he's speaking as a Christian, as a Muslim, I might have a slight disagreement about the phrasing of this. But as a Christian, he says, do they not know that the Father also sent his Son to die for the Vietnamese? It's not the enemy, that's the redeemed. I want to bring that back home today in this age of ISIS, in this age of Boko Haram, in this age of Al-Qaeda. When are we going to straighten up our backs and say, every life is precious? Every life is precious because every life is made by Allah. Every life has had the breath of God breathed into it. Our Islamic tradition teaches us that before every human being is made to manifest for 70,000 years, Allah needs the clay that is going to turn into us, and in every second of every minute, of every hour, of every day, of those 70,000 years, he casts 70,000 love glances at that clay. You are loved by God before you were born. And no human being has the right to break that sacred vessel. Your life is also precious because somebody loved on you. Somebody suffered for you. Your mama, in all likelihood. Someone stayed up in the middle of the night. Someone changed your diaper. Someone nursed you, wiped your tears away. You have value not just because you are made by Allah, as the Christians would say, you're a child of God, you're also your mama's child. it is up to us as prophetic people to be able to stand up and say, every human life is precious, including those that Fanon would have called the non-persons of history. Yes, we're going to mourn the 3 Israeli kidnapped teenagers. They're also children of God. But we're also going to mourn those 2,100 Palestinians. We're going to check our own moral blind spots and figure out why is it that the world can mobilize a coalition of 40 countries to fight ISIS, but there's no coalition to stop the slaughter of 200,000 people in Syria. Why does the life of those 4 beheaded journalists and aid workers matter? And it does matter, but why is it allowed to matter more than the lives of 200,000 Syrians? How are we going to say we have to act up, rise up, stand up, and mobilize, not to make ourselves look good, not to make sure that we're on the good Muslim list, but because it is right, because it's moral, because it's principled, and because we're going to be made to answer for it? Here's where we are now. My government, your government, is spending more on our military than the next 12 countries combined. Brother Martin stands in this church and says, a nation that spends more on its military than it does on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. When they shot Martin, the next Sunday he was going to give a sermon called Why America May Go to Hell. Not, I hope America goes to hell. Not, I think America's going to. Why, if we don't change our way, we may end up there. And what does this tradition have to tell us now? In this dark night, with the full moon of the prophetic consciousness outside, what do we have to say? In this empire that we have become, the Republic has become the empire. Star Wars was right. This empire that goes around killing with impunity and empowers its allies, or what is left of its allies, to kill with impunity. The reason to do so is not just because we're killing Palestinians, not just because we're droning people, we're destroying the fabric of our own American democracy. The American dream that was always also the American nightmare is tilting on the nightmare side. We're on the wrong side of this worldwide revolution of values. So, because we are told that despair is forbidden, I'm going to end with just a simple word. The way that the world is now is not how it has to be. God didn't make the world this way. We do. We broke it. We're borrowing this world from our grandchildren. They deserve to grow up in a world in which they don't have to go to museums to find trees. As Muhammad Yunus says, they should go to museums to see something called poverty. We've got the means. We have the resources. Do we have the love? Do we have the willingness to walk love into the public and call it justice? Are we willing to be participants in making it so? If we do, then rather than just engaging in a PR campaign about Islam, when people remember us, when our grandchildren speak of us, they will say, that was a generation that was a part of restoring a sense of beauty to Islam. That was a generation that attempted to recover something beautiful about the American dream. And as hokey as it is, let my last words be something about the US Constitution. That flawed document of a noble dream. The preamble starts with, "We, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice." And alhamdulillah that it didn't say, "We, the people who've already formed a perfect union." Because by God it was not perfect, and by God it is not perfect. A more perfect union. It's an attempt to grow in the direction of connecting our concerns together. We the people, and may we the people be actually all of us, not just some of us. And if we want to get there, may we work towards establishing justice, justice that is always encompassed in it. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your generosity.